She was just 4 days past her 16th birthday when she stepped out for a short walk, a walk she had taken countless times before. What no one knew was that beneath this railway bridge, a killer was waiting, and would live free for the next 24 years. Someone knew. Someone stayed silent. Hello and welcome to Cold Case Crime Lab. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now, leave a comment below telling us what cold case we should cover next, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. We're diving deep into cases that demand justice, and your support makes all the difference. Now let's get into this haunting story. Let me take you back to a cold, damp Monday evening in the town of Greenhithe, Kent. The date was January the 18th, 1993. A 16-year-old girl named Clare Tiltman was making what should have been a simple walk to visit a friend. Just 4 days before, Clare had celebrated her 16th birthday, surrounded by the love of her parents, Cliff and Linda. She was their only child, the center of their world, a bright and outgoing teenager with dreams as big as the sky above her. That evening, Clare left her home on Woodward Terrace at around 6 o'clock in the evening. She was heading to her friend Victoria's house, about a mile away. The two girls had plans to talk about their futures, to discuss college options after their upcoming GCSE exams. It was the kind of conversation 16-year-olds have all the time, full of hope and possibility, completely unaware of how fragile life can be. Clare's parents had always been protective. As an only child, she meant everything to them. Every parent's instinct is to keep their child safe, to shield them from the dangers of the world. But Clare was 16 now, on the cusp of adulthood, and Cliff and Linda were trying to give her more independence. She enjoyed walking, loved the freedom of moving through her neighborhood on her own terms. That evening, when Victoria's mother offered to give Clare a lift, she politely declined. She wanted to walk. She wanted that independence her parents were beginning to trust her with. The route Clare took that night was one she knew well. She walked through familiar streets, past familiar faces, in a community where she felt safe. Along the way, she stopped at a local corner shop, an off-license, where she purchased a pack of cigarettes. It was a small act of teenage rebellion, the kind that most of us look back on with a mixture of embarrassment and nostalgia. Clare paid for her cigarettes, exchanged a few words with the shopkeeper, and continued on her way. She headed down London Road in Greenhithe, making her way toward an area locals knew as the Arches. This was a railway bridge underpass, a shortcut that could save a few minutes on the walk. It wasn't particularly well lit, but it wasn't considered dangerous either. This was Greenhithe, a small community where people knew their neighbors, where violent crime was something that happened in other places, to other people. But on this particular evening, in this particular place, something unspeakable was about to happen. Clare entered the underpass at approximately 18:15, around 6:15 in the evening. What happened next would shatter not just one family, but an entire community. What happened next would launch one of the longest and most frustrating murder investigations in British criminal history. What happened next would haunt detectives, forensic specialists, and the people of Greenhithe for more than 2 decades. Because somewhere in the shadows of that underpass, someone was waiting. Someone with a knife. Someone with murderous intent. The attack on Clare Tiltman was savage and frenzied. She was stabbed multiple times, the assault so vicious that it spoke of rage, of something dark and uncontrollable in her attacker. Clare fought for her life. Despite her injuries, despite the shock and terror she must have felt, she managed to stagger out of the underpass. She made it approximately 100 yards before she collapsed on the pavement. A passing motorist saw her fall. The driver stopped immediately, realized something terrible had happened, and called for help. Within minutes, emergency services arrived at the scene. Paramedics worked frantically to save Clare's life, but her injuries were catastrophic. She had been stabbed 9 times. 9 brutal, deliberate strikes with a knife. The attack had severed major blood vessels. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, Clare Tiltman was pronounced dead at the scene. A 16-year-old girl, just 4 days past her birthday, with her whole life ahead of her, was gone. Murdered in a random attack in a place she had walked dozens of times before. Killed by someone who had been lying in wait, someone who had chosen that particular spot, that particular evening, to commit an act of unimaginable violence. The news of Clare's death sent shockwaves through Greenhithe and the surrounding areas. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in their community. Not to one of their children. Parents who had been gradually loosening the reins on their teenagers suddenly pulled them back tight. The sense of safety that had defined this small town evaporated in an instant. For Cliff and Linda Tiltman, the world simply stopped. One moment they were parents of a vibrant 16-year-old girl, making plans for her future, watching her grow into a young woman. The next moment, police officers were at their door with news that would destroy them. Their only child, their beloved daughter, had been brutally murdered just a short walk from their home. The investigation began immediately. Kent police threw significant resources at the case. They knew they were dealing with a particularly dangerous individual. The nature of the attack, the frenzied stabbing, the apparent lack of any robbery or sexual assault, all pointed to someone who killed for the sake of killing. This wasn't a murder that arose from an argument or a relationship gone wrong. This appeared to be a stranger attack, which made it both more terrifying and more difficult to solve. Detectives started with the basics. They traced Clare's movements that evening, speaking to everyone who had seen her. The shopkeeper at the off-license confirmed she had been there, had seemed perfectly normal, had given no indication that she felt threatened or followed. Witnesses who had been in the area around the time of the attack were interviewed. Police appealed for anyone who had been near the arches that evening to come forward. The underpass itself became a focal point of the investigation. Forensic teams scoured every inch of the area, looking for evidence that might identify the killer. They found blood, of course, Clare's blood, marking the spot where she had been attacked and the path she had taken as she tried to escape. But finding evidence that belonged to the attacker proved more challenging. This was 1993, remember. DNA technology existed, but it was still in its relative infancy compared to what we have today. The kind of trace DNA analysis that modern forensic teams can perform simply wasn't available back then. Investigators had to rely on more traditional methods, fingerprints, witness statements, physical evidence like fibers or footprints. What they needed most was a witness. Someone who had seen the attacker. Someone who could provide a description, maybe even a name. And incredibly, they got one. Not just one witness, but several people who had been in the area around the time of the murder came forward with descriptions of a suspicious individual. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a young man near the arches around the time Clare was attacked. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. He was described as being in his late teens to early 20s, with collar-length sandy or mousy brown hair. He was wearing dark clothing. Several witnesses said he appeared agitated or nervous. One witness reported seeing him walk quickly away from the area just after the time the attack would have occurred. This was a significant breakthrough. Police now had a description to work with. They created a photo-fit image based on the witness statements and released it to the public. The image showed a young man with a distinctive appearance, and investigators were hopeful that someone would recognize him. The response from the public was immediate. Tips and potential leads flooded in. Police followed up on hundreds of calls, each one representing a possible breakthrough. But as often happens in major investigations, the sheer volume of information became overwhelming. Every lead had to be checked, every tip investigated, every name that came up had to be thoroughly examined. In the days and weeks following Clare's murder, police conducted one of the largest manhunts in Kent's history. They interviewed thousands of people. They took statements from anyone who had been in Greenhithe that evening. They looked at known offenders in the area, anyone with a history of violence or sexual assault. They examined Clare's life in detail, looking for any connection that might lead them to her killer. But Clare's life was exactly what it appeared to be. She was a normal 16-year-old girl. She had friends, went to school, had typical teenage interests and concerns. There was no dark secret in her past, no dangerous relationship, no connection to criminal activity. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, the victim of what appeared to be a random attack by a stranger. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued at full intensity. Police were under enormous pressure to solve the case. The community was terrified. Parents were afraid to let their children out of their sight. The idea that a killer could be walking among them, could have committed such a brutal murder and simply melted back into everyday life, was almost unbearable. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was that police believed the killer was local. The location of the attack suggested someone who knew the area well, who knew that the Arches would be a relatively secluded spot at that time of evening. The witness description suggested someone young, possibly still living with parents or in the local area. Investigators became convinced that the answer was somewhere in Greenhithe or the immediate vicinity. They launched appeals directly to the community. Someone knows something, they insisted. Someone has a son or a brother or a neighbor who came home that night with blood on his clothes, acting strangely, with scratches or injuries that couldn't be explained. Someone has been protecting this person, covering for them, choosing loyalty over justice. But no one came forward with that crucial piece of information. No mother turned in her son. No neighbor reported their suspicions. The wall of silence held firm. As the first anniversary of Clare's death approached, police made a decision that was both desperate and inspired. They would stage a reconstruction of Clare's last journey. On the 18th of January, 1994, exactly 1 year after the murder, a young woman of similar appearance to Clare would walk the same route, at the same time, wearing similar clothing. Police hoped this would jog memories, would bring forward witnesses who had seen something but hadn't realized its significance. The reconstruction drew significant media attention. Television cameras followed the young woman as she retraced Clare's steps. The story was featured prominently on news programs. Police received another wave of tips and potential leads. But once again, despite the best efforts of the investigative team, nothing concrete emerged. The case remained unsolved. For Cliff and Linda Tiltman, this was an unbearable reality. Not only had they lost their daughter in the most horrific way imaginable, but they had no justice. The person who had killed Clare was still out there, still free, still living their life while Clare's had been cut brutally short. The Tiltmans became advocates for their daughter, keeping her case in the public eye, never letting the police or the public forget about Clare. As the investigation entered its second year, then its third, the active phase began to wind down. This didn't mean the case was closed or forgotten. It remained open, and detectives continued to work on it when new information emerged. But the reality was that without significant new leads, there was only so much that could be done. The case was becoming cold. This is the nightmare scenario for any murder investigation. A case that starts with significant evidence, witness statements, and public attention, but gradually goes quiet as all the leads are exhausted and no arrest is made. For the family of the victim, it's a special kind of torture. The case may be cold for the police, but for them, the pain is as fresh as the day they got the news. Throughout the late 90s and into the 2000s, Clare's case remained in a kind of limbo. Periodically, on significant anniversaries, the police would make renewed appeals. The media would run stories reminding people of the unsolved murder. Tips would come in, be investigated, and lead nowhere. The case file grew thicker, filled with witness statements, forensic reports, and investigative notes, but no closer to resolution. Then, in 2013, 20 years after Clare's murder, something changed. Advances in DNA technology had been progressing rapidly throughout the 2000s. Techniques that were impossible in 1993 were now standard practice. Forensic teams could extract DNA from smaller and smaller samples. They could create profiles from touch DNA, from cells left behind by simple contact. They could work with degraded samples that would have been useless decades earlier. Kent police made the decision to review the Clare Tiltman case using these new techniques. The evidence collected at the scene in 1993 had been carefully preserved. Now, 20 years later, it would be re-examined using technology that didn't exist when it was first collected. The forensic team began the painstaking process of going through all the physical evidence. They were looking for DNA that belonged to neither Clare nor any of the known people who had been at the scene for legitimate reasons. They were looking for the killer's DNA. And they found it. On Clare's clothing, forensic scientists were able to extract a DNA profile that didn't match Clare or anyone else who should have been there. The profile was partial, not complete, but it was enough. It was enough to search against the National DNA Database. It was enough, potentially, to identify Clare's killer after 2 decades. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. We're about to get to the breakthrough that changed everything. The DNA was run through the database. Police were looking for a match, hoping that at some point in the intervening 20 years, Clare's killer had been arrested for another offense and had their DNA taken. It was a long shot, but it was the best chance they'd had in 2 decades. The database search came back with a hit. A match. After 20 years, they had a name. Colin Ash Smith. Detectives must have felt a mixture of elation and frustration when they saw that name. Because Colin Ash Smith wasn't a stranger to police. In fact, he had been investigated in connection with Clare's murder back in 1993. He had been one of hundreds of people in the area who had been interviewed. But at the time, there hadn't been enough evidence to charge him, and he had slipped through the investigative net. Now, 20 years later, science had caught up with him. Colin Ash Smith was 46 years old in 2013. He had been 26 at the time of Clare's murder, which fit the witness descriptions of a man in his late teens to early 20s. He had lived locally, knew the area well. He had been in the vicinity on the night of the murder. All of this had been known in 1993, but it hadn't been enough. Now, with DNA evidence linking him directly to the crime scene, it was more than enough. On the 22nd of May, 2013, Colin Ash Smith was arrested and charged with the murder of Clare Tiltman. The news sent shockwaves through Greenhithe once again. After 20 years, after so many false hopes and dead ends, there was finally going to be justice for Clare. For Cliff and Linda Tiltman, now in their 70s, the arrest was bittersweet. They had waited 2 decades for this moment. 2 decades of grief, of wondering, of hoping that someday the person who killed their daughter would be held accountable. But the arrest couldn't bring Clare back. It couldn't give them back the life their daughter should have had. It couldn't erase 20 years of pain. As investigators began to build their case against Colin Ash Smith, a disturbing picture emerged. This wasn't a man who had made one terrible mistake. This was someone with a history of violence, particularly violence against women. And the evidence suggested that Clare Tiltman might not have been his only victim. In November 1993, less than a year after Clare's murder, a woman named Anna Hedges had been brutally attacked in her own home in Tunbridge, Kent, just 17 miles from where Clare was killed. Anna was 44 years old at the time. She was at home alone when someone broke in and attacked her. She was stabbed 7 times in a frenzied assault that was terrifyingly similar to the attack on Clare Tiltman. But unlike Clare, Anna Hedges survived. She fought off her attacker and managed to raise the alarm. Her injuries were severe, life-threatening, but she lived. At the time, police investigated the attack thoroughly, but no arrest was made. The case went cold. Now, 20 years later, as detectives looked into Colin Ash Smith's background, they found connections to the Anna Hedges attack. The similarities between the 2 crimes were striking. Both were brutal knife attacks. Both showed a level of rage and violence that went beyond what would be necessary to disable a victim. Both appeared to be attacks by a stranger, with no apparent motive beyond the violence itself. Police began to suspect that Colin Ash Smith was responsible for both attacks. But proving it was another matter. The attack on Anna Hedges had occurred 20 years earlier. Evidence had been preserved, but would it be enough to link Ash Smith to that crime as well? As the investigation continued, an even darker possibility emerged. Could there be other victims? Colin Ash Smith had lived in the area for decades. If he was capable of attacking Clare Tiltman and Anna Hedges, what else might he have done? Police began the grim task of reviewing unsolved attacks on women in Kent over the previous 20 years, looking for other crimes that might bear Ash Smith's signature. The case against Colin Ash Smith for Clare's murder, however, was solid. The DNA evidence was compelling. Even though 20 years had passed, forensic science had provided the proof that traditional detective work couldn't deliver in 1993. Ash Smith was going to trial. The trial of Colin Ash Smith for the murder of Clare Tiltman began at Inner London Crown Court in November 2014. 21 years had passed since that cold January evening when Clare had set out to visit her friend. 21 years during which Colin Ash Smith had been free, living his life, while the Tiltmans endured a grief that never diminished. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the DNA evidence. They presented expert testimony explaining how Ash Smith's DNA had been found on Clare's clothing. They presented the witness statements from 1993, the descriptions that matched Ash Smith's appearance at the time. They built a picture of a man who had been in the area, who fit the description, and whose DNA was at the crime scene. The defense tried to challenge the DNA evidence, suggesting contamination or questioning the techniques used to extract and analyze samples that were 20 years old. But the prosecution's forensic experts were thorough and convincing. The DNA was there. It was Ash Smith's. And there was no innocent explanation for how it got on Clare's clothing. The prosecution also introduced evidence of Ash Smith's character and history. They talked about the attack on Anna Hedges, though Ash Smith was not on trial for that crime. They painted a picture of a violent man, someone capable of the kind of frenzied attack that had killed Clare. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when the prosecution read victim impact statements from Clare's parents. Cliff and Linda Tiltman described their 21 years of grief, of wondering, of hoping for justice. They talked about Clare, about the vibrant young woman she had been, about the future that had been stolen from her. They talked about the empty space in their lives that could never be filled. Colin Ash Smith sat through the trial showing little emotion. He maintained his innocence, claiming he had nothing to do with Clare's death. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning their verdict. On the 20th of November, 2014, Colin Ash Smith was found guilty of the murder of Clare Tiltman. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Cliff and Linda Tiltman wept. They had finally, after 21 years, gotten justice for their daughter. The judge, Mr. Justice Sweeney, addressed Colin Ash Smith before sentencing. He spoke of the brutality of the attack, of the devastation it had caused to Clare's family, of the fear it had instilled in the community. He noted that this was clearly a premeditated attack, that Ash Smith had been lying in wait for a victim, and that Clare had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Colin Ash Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years before he could be considered for parole. Given that he was already 47 years old at the time of sentencing, and given the nature of his crime, it was entirely possible he would never be released. But the story didn't end there. Police were still investigating the attack on Anna Hedges. And as they dug deeper into that case, reviewing the evidence with fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques, they found what they were looking for. DNA evidence that linked Colin Ash Smith to the attack on Anna Hedges. In February 2015, just months after being convicted of Clare Tiltman's murder, Colin Ash Smith was charged with the attempted murder of Anna Hedges. Once again, he would stand trial. Once again, he would be forced to confront the consequences of his violent actions. The trial for the Anna Hedges attack took place later in 2015. The evidence was remarkably similar to the Clare Tiltman case. DNA linked Ash Smith to the crime scene. The nature of the attack was nearly identical, a frenzied knife assault that showed rage and a desire to kill. The only difference was that Anna Hedges had survived. Anna Hedges herself testified at the trial. After 22 years, she finally faced her attacker in court. She described the terror of that day in November 1993, when a stranger had broken into her home and tried to kill her. She talked about the physical scars she still carried, the psychological trauma that had never fully healed. She looked directly at Colin Ash Smith and told him how he had destroyed her sense of safety, how she had spent more than 2 decades looking over her shoulder, wondering if her attacker would return. Once again, the jury found Colin Ash Smith guilty. He was convicted of attempted murder and grievous bodily harm with intent. The judge imposed an additional sentence, to run concurrently with his life sentence for Clare's murder. The message was clear: Colin Ash Smith would spend the rest of his life in prison. As the full picture of Colin Ash Smith's crimes became clear, investigators continued to wonder if there might be other victims. The man had shown a pattern of extreme violence against women. He had struck in 1993 with Clare Tiltman, and again later that same year with Anna Hedges. What had he been doing in the years before? What about the years after? Police reviewed numerous unsolved cases, looking for connections to Ash Smith. While they couldn't definitively link him to other specific crimes, the investigation raised troubling questions. Had Colin Ash Smith been a serial attacker who had simply been lucky enough to avoid detection for most of his crimes? Were there other women out there who had been attacked by him but whose cases had never been solved? These are questions that may never be fully answered. What is certain is that Colin Ash Smith was a dangerous predator who should have been caught much sooner. The fact that he was interviewed in connection with Clare's murder in 1993 but not arrested meant that he was free to attack Anna Hedges later that same year. If the DNA technology of 2013 had existed in 1993, Anna Hedges might never have been attacked. That's a sobering thought. The case of Clare Tiltman became a landmark in demonstrating the importance of preserving evidence in unsolved cases. The DNA that eventually convicted Colin Ash Smith was collected in 1993 and carefully stored for 20 years until technology caught up. This case proved that cold cases can be solved, that justice can come even after decades, and that families should never give up hope. For Cliff and Linda Tiltman, the convictions of Colin Ash Smith brought a measure of peace, but the pain of losing Clare never went away. In interviews after the trial, they spoke about their relief that justice had finally been served, but also about the enormous hole in their lives that Clare's absence had created. They had missed her 17th birthday, her 18th, her 21st. They had missed her graduation, her wedding, the grandchildren they would never have. 21 years of milestones that never happened because a violent man had decided to take their daughter's life. Linda Tiltman became an advocate for other families of murder victims, working with support groups and charities. She channeled her grief into helping others navigate the nightmare of losing a loved one to violence. Cliff and Linda both spoke publicly about the importance of never giving up on cold cases, of keeping pressure on police to continue investigating, of using new technology to review old evidence. The case also highlighted the role of witness testimony. Multiple people had seen Colin Ash Smith near the scene of Clare's murder. Their descriptions had been remarkably consistent. But in 1993, without DNA evidence to back it up, witness testimony alone wasn't enough to secure a conviction. It took 20 years and advances in forensic science to transform those witness statements into a conviction. Colin Ash Smith never explained why he killed Clare Tiltman. He never showed remorse. He maintained his innocence even after being convicted. This is something that families of murder victims often struggle with, the lack of answers. Why did this happen? What was the killer thinking? What motivated such senseless violence? In Ash Smith's case, psychological evaluation suggested he had deep-seated issues with women and a propensity for explosive violence. But these clinical explanations don't really answer the question of why. Why Clare? Why that particular evening? Why such a brutal attack? The truth is that sometimes there are no satisfying answers. Sometimes evil is just evil. Sometimes violence is random and senseless. Clare Tiltman was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. She encountered a violent predator who was looking for a victim, and she paid with her life. It could have been anyone. The randomness of it makes it even more terrifying. The investigation into Clare's murder involved thousands of hours of police work, hundreds of interviews, and eventually, cutting-edge forensic science. It showed both the limitations and the power of modern investigative techniques. Traditional detective work in 1993 came close to identifying the killer but couldn't quite get there. DNA technology 20 years later provided the final piece of the puzzle. This case has been studied by law enforcement agencies as an example of how cold cases should be handled. The decision to preserve all evidence, even when the case appeared to be going nowhere, was crucial. The willingness to revisit the case with new technology was essential. The persistence of the investigators, who never completely gave up on finding Clare's killer, made the difference. The community of Greenhithe was forever changed by Clare's murder. The sense of innocence and safety that had existed before January 18, 1993, never fully returned. Parents became more cautious. The Arches, where Clare was attacked, became a place people avoided, especially after dark. The murder left a scar on the community that time couldn't fully heal. But there was also something positive that emerged from the tragedy. The community came together in their grief and their determination to see justice done. They supported the Tiltman family. They kept Clare's memory alive. They provided information to police, attended vigils, and refused to let her become just another statistic. That community solidarity, that refusal to forget, played a role in keeping the case active in the public consciousness. When Colin Ash Smith was finally convicted, there was a sense of relief throughout Greenhithe. The monster who had terrorized their community was finally behind bars. Parents could breathe a little easier. The case that had haunted them for 21 years was finally resolved. The story of Clare Tiltman is ultimately a story about persistence, the persistence of her family in seeking justice, the persistence of investigators in refusing to give up on the case, and the persistence of science in finding new ways to extract truth from old evidence. It's a reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Sometimes it takes years, even decades, but the truth can emerge. It's also a cautionary tale about the predators who walk among us. Colin Ash Smith lived in the community for years after killing Clare and attacking Anna Hedges. He had friends, neighbors, possibly even family who had no idea what he was capable of. He was able to hide in plain sight because people couldn't imagine that someone they knew could be capable of such violence. The case raises important questions about how we identify and stop violent predators before they can claim more victims. What warning signs did Colin Ash Smith show before he killed Clare? Were there earlier incidents that should have been taken more seriously? Could anything have been done to prevent these attacks? These are difficult questions without easy answers. The reality is that we live in a society that values freedom and privacy, which sometimes means giving people the benefit of the doubt until they commit a serious crime. It's a delicate balance between civil liberties and public safety, and cases like Clare Tiltman's show us how tragically wrong things can go. For law enforcement, the case demonstrated the critical importance of DNA databases. Colin Ash Smith's DNA was on file because of later offenses. When the technology finally allowed investigators to extract a usable profile from the evidence in Clare's case, the database made the connection. Without that database, even with the DNA profile, finding the match would have been nearly impossible. This has led to ongoing debates about the scope of DNA databases. Should everyone's DNA be on file? Should DNA be taken from people arrested but not convicted? How long should DNA profiles be retained? Clare Tiltman's case is often cited in arguments for expanding DNA collection, on the grounds that a more comprehensive database might solve more cold cases. The advancement of DNA technology continues to offer hope for other cold cases. Techniques that didn't exist when Clare's case was reviewed in 2013 now exist. Cases that seemed unsolvable even a few years ago are being reopened with new scientific tools. Clare's case has become a symbol of hope for families who are still waiting for answers. The media coverage of Colin Ash Smith's trials was extensive. The case had everything that draws public attention: an innocent young victim, a decades-long mystery, cutting-edge science, and finally, justice served. Documentaries have been made about the case. It's been featured in true crime programs and podcasts. Clare's story has reached millions of people. For the Tiltman family, this public attention has been both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it keeps Clare's memory alive. It ensures that her short life is remembered for more than just how it ended. On the other hand, it means reliving the tragedy over and over, having their deepest pain exposed to public scrutiny. Cliff Tiltman passed away in 2018, 4 years after seeing his daughter's killer convicted. Linda has said that finally getting justice for Clare allowed Cliff to find some peace in his final years. He had lived for more than 2 decades with the weight of Clare's unsolved murder. Seeing Colin Ashsmith convicted lifted that weight, at least partially. Linda continues to keep Clare's memory alive and to advocate for victims' families. She has spoken about the importance of never giving up hope, even when a case seems impossible to solve. She credits the detectives who worked on Clare's case over the years, particularly those who made the decision to review the evidence using new DNA technology. The detectives who worked on the case have spoken about how personally invested they became in finding Clare's killer. Some of them had daughters around Clare's age. They understood the Tiltmans' pain on a visceral level. The case stayed with them throughout their careers. When the DNA match came back identifying Colin Ashsmith, these detectives felt a mixture of triumph and sadness, triumph that they had finally solved the case, but sadness that it had taken so long. One detective who worked on the case from the beginning until the conviction said that Clare Tiltman's murder was the case that defined his career. He had worked hundreds of cases over the years, but none affected him like Clare's. The senselessness of it, the brutality, the years of frustration as leads went nowhere, all of it stayed with him. When Colin Ashsmith was finally convicted, this detective said he went home and wept with relief. The forensic scientists who extracted the DNA evidence from Clare's clothing 20 years after her death described the immense pressure they felt. They knew this was likely the only chance to get usable DNA from evidence that had been sitting in storage for 2 decades. They knew that a family had been waiting 20 years for answers. The painstaking work of extracting and analyzing that DNA took months. When they finally got a usable profile and it matched Colin Ashsmith in the database, they knew they had changed everything. Anna Hedges, the survivor of Ashsmith's second known attack, has also spoken publicly about her experience. She described the terror of being attacked in her own home, the long physical recovery from her stab wounds, and the even longer psychological recovery from the trauma. For 22 years, she didn't know who had attacked her or why. When she learned that Colin Ashsmith had been arrested and that DNA linked him to her attack, she felt a flood of emotions: relief, anger, validation. At Ashsmith's trial for her attempted murder, Anna Hedges looked him in the eye and told him that he had failed. He had tried to kill her, but she had survived. She had rebuilt her life. She had refused to let him destroy her. Her testimony was powerful and moving, a testament to human resilience in the face of terrible violence. The parallels between the attack on Clare and the attack on Anna are chilling. Both were knife attacks. Both showed extreme violence. Both appeared to be attacks on random victims. The main difference was that Clare died and Anna survived. Anna has said that she feels a deep connection to Clare and her family, united by having encountered the same monster. She has spoken about feeling guilty that she survived when Clare didn't, even though she knows rationally that neither attack was her fault. The question of whether Colin Ashsmith attacked other women remains open. Police have never found definitive evidence linking him to other specific crimes, but the possibility remains. His pattern of violence, the randomness of his victim selection, and the years he remained free all suggest he could have committed other attacks. There may be women out there who were attacked by Colin Ashsmith but whose cases were never solved, who never got the closure that Anna Hedges eventually received. This is one of the most troubling aspects of cases like this. When a predator is finally caught and convicted, we naturally wonder what else they might have done. In Ashsmith's case, he was interviewed in connection with Clare's murder in 1993 but released. He then went on to attack Anna Hedges later that same year. What if he had been arrested after the first interview? Anna would never have been attacked. What if there were other victims before Clare? Could earlier intervention have saved her life? These are impossible questions to answer definitively, but they point to the importance of thorough investigation and the use of every available tool to identify and stop violent criminals. They also highlight the limitations of investigation in the era before DNA technology was widely available. The detectives who interviewed Colin Ash Smith in 1993 may have suspected him, but without physical evidence to back up their suspicions, there was nothing they could do. The case has also raised questions about how violent offenders are managed and monitored. Colin Ash Smith had some previous encounters with law enforcement before Clare's murder, though nothing that would have flagged him as a potential killer. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, were there warning signs that should have been taken more seriously? Could a different approach to managing individuals with violent tendencies have prevented these attacks? Again, these are difficult questions without easy answers. We can't lock people up for crimes they might commit in the future. We can't monitor everyone who shows troubling behavior. But cases like Clare Tiltman's push us to think about how we can better identify those who pose a serious risk and intervene before they harm others. The legal proceedings against Colin Ash Smith were lengthy and complex. The defense challenged every aspect of the prosecution's case, as is their right and duty in our legal system. They questioned the reliability of DNA evidence that was 20 years old. They suggested alternative explanations for how Ash Smith's DNA might have ended up at the crime scene. They challenged witness identifications from 2 decades earlier. But the prosecution's case was solid. The DNA evidence was backed up by multiple expert witnesses who explained the science in detail. The witness statements from 1993 were consistent and credible. The similarities between Clare's murder and Anna's attack showed a pattern of behavior. The jury was convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. The sentencing of Colin Ash Smith reflected the seriousness of his crimes. A life sentence with a minimum term of 21 years meant that he would be an old man before he could even be considered for parole. And given the nature of his crimes, the lack of remorse he showed, and the danger he posed to the public, it was unlikely he would ever be released. He would, in all likelihood, die in prison. For the Tiltman family and for Anna Hedges, this was important. The idea that Colin Ash Smith might one day walk free was unbearable. They needed to know that he would be locked away for the rest of his life, that he would never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else. The case of Clare Tiltman has been incorporated into training for law enforcement agencies around the world. It's used as an example of the importance of evidence preservation, the value of revisiting cold cases with new technology, and the power of DNA databases. Police academies study the case to understand both what went right and what could have been done better. Forensic science programs use the case to illustrate advances in DNA technology and the importance of continued research and development. The techniques that identified Colin Ash Smith as Clare's killer didn't exist when she was murdered. They were developed in the intervening 20 years. This shows the value of investing in forensic research and technology. Victim advocacy groups point to the case as an example of why cold cases should never be closed or forgotten. Families deserve answers, no matter how long it takes. And with advancing technology, cases that seemed hopeless may suddenly become solvable. Clare's family waited 21 years, but they got their answers. Other families are still waiting. Clare's case gives them hope. The emotional toll of a case like this on everyone involved cannot be overstated. For Clare's family, 21 years of grief, of wondering, of hoping for justice, was almost unbearable. For the investigators, years of frustration, of following leads that went nowhere, of knowing the killer was probably out there but being unable to catch him, took a toll. For the community, the fear and uncertainty that came from knowing a killer was among them was traumatic. But there was also resilience. The Tiltmans channeled their grief into advocacy. The investigators never gave up. The community came together in support and solidarity. And ultimately, justice was served. Today, Clare Tiltman is remembered not just as a victim, but as a person. She was a bright, outgoing 16-year-old with dreams and potential. She loved her parents. She had friends. She was planning her future. Her life mattered, and though it was cut tragically short, she is not forgotten. There is a memorial to Clare in Greenhithe. People still leave flowers there on the anniversary of her death. Her name is spoken with respect and sadness by those who remember her. She has become a symbol of the innocent lives stolen by violence, and of the importance of never giving up the fight for justice. The story of Clare Tiltman is a reminder that behind every crime statistic is a real person, a real family, real grief. It's easy to become numb to reports of violence when they're just headlines or numbers. But every victim was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for answers, still hoping for justice. It's also a story about the power of science and persistence. DNA technology gave investigators the tool they needed to finally solve Clare's case. But it was the decision to preserve evidence, to keep the case active, to review it with new technology, that made the difference. Without those decisions, Colin Ashsmith might never have been caught. As we close this case, it's important to remember that there are still thousands of unsolved murders, thousands of families still waiting for answers. Some of those cases may seem hopeless, the trail's long since gone cold. But Clare Tiltman's case shows us that it's never too late. Technology advances. New evidence emerges. Witnesses come forward. Cold cases can be solved. If you've watched this entire investigation with us, I want to thank you for giving Clare's story the attention it deserves. Her life mattered. Her death mattered. And the fight for justice, no matter how long it takes, always matters. Before you go, please hit that like button, leave a comment telling us what you think about this case, and make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Crime Lab. We're committed to bringing you the stories of those who can no longer speak for themselves, and to showing that justice, even when delayed, can still be achieved. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. And thank you for helping us keep Clare's memory alive.